Wonderful. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Comprehensivist Wednesday, and I'm delighted to start this series with Sanjay on neuroscience. So take it away, Sanjay.
All right. I wanted to do a talk on some core concepts in neuroscience. We've done a few already in specific areas, just to see how interest was, and also to basically go into some of the more interesting areas of neuroscience. But I think at this point, it's important for us to go into, a lot of the neuroscience is a very broad area, very broad area of science, and it requires some fundamental knowledge for people to really grasp exactly what's being discussed. And a lot of the work, because it is an area of science and it's a professional area, a lot of the work is done in scholarly papers and articles. And most people would not read those, though sometimes may run across those on the internet. And to understand those, or to understand, let's say, news articles, there's a lot of depth behind the ideas that are presented. So what I wanted to do in this talk is to go over some of those initial ideas, and also to give people an understanding of what neuroscience really entails, how neuroscientists look at our brain. So this talk is primarily about our brain and the nervous system, which the brain is a part of. So I wanted to go into some of this. Now, if we're not able to finish everything this time, what I was thinking of doing was maybe having another part 2 of this, but more animated with more visuals. I don't have a lot of visual. I have some, but not too many visuals today. I have static images, but I know that it's easier for people to understand using videos and other techniques. And I couldn't find a lot of videos that I found would be useful that are short form, just a few minutes. So I'll try to find those if we do want to do this later as a part 2. So this first is we'll go in. I have slides. I have a slideshow prepared, which may help people to follow along. So let me put this up.
While you're doing that, so folks, the format is that Sanjay has 2-part presentation. After the first part, we will be doing breakout rooms, so we get to discuss those ideas in groups of 6 or 8. And then we'll come back for the second presentation, and then we'll go back into breakout rooms, and then we'll do takeaways. After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and type in the questions, starting with exclamation mark, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. All right, so that's the plan. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you. All right, so let me just start. So today we're talking about some core concepts in neuroscience. And basically, what do we need to know? What does the average person need to know if you don't have a background in science, or if you do, but you have a background in other areas of science? What would you need to understand typical concepts in neuroscience? So initially, let's first talk about what is neuroscience in general. So neuroscience it's a science-based study of our nervous system. Its development, the structures that form the brain, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, functions, disease states. It's actually more broad, but these are just some of the areas that it covers. It tries to understand, it tries to model, and it tries to predict changes in our brain, in our nervous system, as well as behavioral aspects and changes, and also to find causality, causal links for what causes us to behave in certain ways, what causes us to do certain things. And it looks at both positive behaviors as well as negative behavior. So it's looking at every aspect of the brain, things that we want to happen, things that we don't want to happen, things that are subconscious or hidden, and things that are overt. And it incorporates a lot of broad areas of related sciences. So for example, physiology and anatomy, it includes that, but it focuses on cytology, which is a study of cells, and molecular biology. It looks at areas of mathematics, for example, network science, and there's an area called graph theory. And the reason for that is really that it's using, we'll get into this later, but the brain is a network of neurons. It's a very large network of neurons. And so network science is a big part of that. Systems theory, that's also something that comes into play, because the brain and our nervous system is really a complex system. And as we've talked about in other talks, the system is a complex mechanism, let's say, that has subparts. Those subparts are related, are connected in some way, and each of those subparts act together and they act independently. But the overall system has very complex behavior when everything acts together. So neurology, psychiatry, psychology, even paleontology, all of these areas go into the neurosciences. So this is just an initial overview. So why do we have a brain or a nervous system, right? So this is more from the, initially I said paleontology. This is from the paleontological view of why did our brain form? When we animals evolved from very primitive beings, the most primitive animals did not have a brain. Amoeba, single-celled organisms, hydra, these types of organisms don't have a brain. They barely have a nervous system, if you can call it that. And then as they became more complex, insects and then amphibians and eventually birds and even dinosaurs, mammals, and we are mammals, but we're primates. So all of the more complex animals have nervous systems and brains. So, and some of these things we've talked about early, but I wanted to present it in case somebody hasn't been exposed to these already. So our brain and our nervous system is an organ system, and it's evolved primarily for survival purposes. It's something that lets us, it aids in our survival in a very complex and possibly dangerous world. So our brain and nervous system allows us to operate successfully in the world. It allows us to observe. We can see things with our eyes, with our senses. We can perceive the situation around us. We can actually act and use our muscles and possibly ambulate, walk and move. We may, if we have limbs, then we can use our limbs to grasp and manipulate objects. We might find a food, we might forage, we might have to fight. So there's a lot of activity that we have to do to operate successfully in the world. One of the principal functions of the brain is actually to manage energy, because as an organism, again, for survival purposes, energy is critical. There's only so much energy we can obtain through food, and every heartbeat, every movement that we make exerts energy. It uses energy. So our body has to manage this energy very efficiently, and the brain actually does that in many ways. It does it in the background, but there's more complex things that it does. But energy management is a very important part of it. The evolution of the brain actually happened over hundreds of millions of years. And for us, for our human brain, for the primate brain, it began around 300 million years ago. MYA stands for million years ago. And it began, the most primitive part of our brain, which is the brain stem, started forming around 300 million years ago. And most simple animals have that brain stem. And that brain stem allows us to have a heartbeat that's autonomous. We don't have to think about making our heart beat. Our heart automatically beats. Our respiration is also automatic. Sweating is automatic. Digestive system is automatic. There are many functions in the body that the body needs to have regularly operating that the brain handles, the brainstem handles automatically. And so 300 million years ago, approximately, that area of the brain began forming. And most animals that evolved from that primitive animal has a brainstem, in one form or another. Then around 200 million years ago, there was another part of our brain that developed, which in primates is known as the limbic system. And that primarily deals with
Sanjay, I'm
emotions.
sorry to interrupt you. There is a hissing sound from your sound system. Maybe we can reduce it instead of at the maximum level, make it maybe 80% or so, and see if it gets rid of the hiss.
Let me see how I can do that. In screen share, it's a different menu. So okay, let me see if I can do it through here. Sorry about that. I think my any difference?
Yeah, this is better.
That's better. Okay.
Yes.
And my volume should be okay.
Yeah, your volume is fine. Go ahead.
So 200 million years ago, we developed a limbic system, and the limbic system is primarily the emotional center of our brain. It helps us manage the world emotionally. So most animals that we see, cats, dogs, horses, rabbits, lizards, these types of animals have a limbic system, and they primarily operate at that level. And then the most recent part of our human brain is the cortex, the neocortex, which developed between 1 million and 4 million years ago. And that is the most complex part of our brain, and it helps us to think and do much more complex behaviors. So the brain, again, evolved for us to survive and function in a complex world. The next uh, activity that the brain or nervous system does, it allows us to control different aspects of our world. And I talked about some of these. It allows us to control our body um, autonomically and also intentionally. So autonomically is where the body does a lot of things automatically. We don't have to think about how to balance. And that, in a sense, is our autonomic nervous system, although the autonomic nervous system also is broken down into subcategories. So it's something that we learn as an infant. But once we learn it, our brain begins to do it automatically. So when we're walking, we don't have to think about balancing ourselves while we walk. That part is automatically done. And intentional is where if we think about moving our hand or speaking, moving our lips and tongue, that's the intentional part of controlling our body. We're able to control our surroundings again with our limbs, and possibly even our voice and gestures. We can control our emotions, and this gets into brain states. Affect is an idea in psychology and psychiatry, and the hypothalamus is something that helps us do that. It helps us control not only the emotions that we have inside, but how we communicate with emotions with other people. And lastly, areas of cognition. These are the more advanced areas of our behavior. So understanding things, understanding that we're conscious, understanding that we um, are understanding another person, or if we get confused, letting them know. So, communication, these things. So things inside of our brain, things inside of our body, as well as outside of our body. These are the areas that we are able to understand with our brain and nervous system. Next, we'll go into what does our nervous system do? So first, um, let me go into the different uh, structures within the nervous system. So our central nervous system is one of the parts, and that primarily consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So in that image, it's the yellow sections, the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain is, we talked about the brain. Everyone, I think, knows what that is. The spinal cord is basically, it's a cluster of nerves that transfer information signals between the brain and the rest of the body. Um, and the spinal cord is primarily it's the most dense set of nerves in our body, but it's also the most important set of nerves because that's really what allows our brain to interact with our body. And if there's any damage, it's pretty serious. So that's an area that's inside the vertebrate column inside bones. The second section is the peripheral nervous system. And this is the section in blue in this diagram. And this has two parts, the somatic nervous system and the autonomous nervous system. The somatic nervous system is that part which helps us to sense things from our body. So for example, when we sense the temperature outside, is it freezing outside? If we have goosebumps, things like that, that's our somatic nervous system that's sensing that. Also, it allows us to move our muscles. For example, when our eyes blink, when our neck moves, these are all part of our somatic system. Even listening is part of our somatic system. And the autonomous system is, again, we talked about this earlier, it's those things that are automatically done for us. And there are two parts to that, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And the parasympathetic there's basically things that operate at a very slow pace. And so it's termed the rest and digest part of our central nervous system, of our peripheral nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is, you can say it's the fight or flight. It's whenever our body gets activated in a heightened sense of activation, and oftentimes that's for survival, but it can be for other purposes, that sympathetic nervous system comes into play. So these are basically the nervous system lets our brain interact with the rest of our body and interact with the world outside of our body. Now, one of the things that we do, and for example, when, we talk about feelings and emotions and thoughts, right? So feelings and emotions, most of us understand feelings and emotions that we have in our mind, but there actually are feelings and emotions that we also have in our body. And some of you may have felt this when you're nervous, you have an exam or you have something coming up that you're concerned about, that you may have anxiety about. And you have this feeling in your stomach, in your gut, that gives you a queasiness, or it might be the feeling of butterflies in your stomach, or if you have stress in your shoulders, or these are all feelings that you have in your body, but they have parallel feelings in the brain. And so the peripheral nervous system allows our brain to not only sense but also create these feelings in our body, and vice versa. When our different organs in our body are in a certain state, in a state of stress, let's say, for example, our digestive system is something that commonly can go into stress, and it is able to communicate to our brain using the peripheral, the somatic, especially the somatic nervous system. So the nervous system is something that lets us um, perceive the world around us, inside and outside. That's what the nervous system primarily does. Um, Next, we'll talk about the human brain and what's special about it. Why is our brain special? So, what makes the human brain special? So, there are various traits and abilities that our brain has, and here I'm talking specifically about the human brain. We have an ability to make novel tools. We make physical tools that we're all aware of. We invented the wheel. Humans in prehistory invented the wheel, fire, you can say, cave paintings. Early on, we may have used sticks to either attack others or to, let's say, go into an anthill and pull out ants for food. These were primates, not necessarily humans, but primates. But it's the same concept. And the second type of tools that we make are conceptual or cognitive tools. For example, language is a tool that we invented. Language is a very powerful tool. We also have social rules that we've invented to guide our own behavior and our interpersonal relationships so that people don't misbehave and mistreat each other. So the certain social rules that we've created to control our own and other people's behavior. So there are many, many types of tools. So tool making is one major aspect that the human brain does. Cognitive adaptation and complex learning. We're able to do a lot of, our brain is able to learn. So first, our brain, when we're born, our brain is formed with innate things that it already knows. And then after we're born, we begin to observe the world around us, and we can learn from that observations. We learn from others around us. We learn from our own behaviors. We learn just by observing the world. For example, if we see that a rock falls or a tree falls, we learn from that. Another person doesn't have to do that, or we don't have to do it. We might learn the concept of gravity when we see a tree fall, or if we see objects fall multiple times, we'll realize that things fall generally in a certain direction toward the ground. And we may conceptualize that and form this model of our world around us and say that, well, things fall from up to down. And, a child may not have a word for that. They may not call it gravity, but in school, they may learn that what the intuitive sense that they learn that things always go from up to down, they fall from up to down. They may learn in school that that's called gravity. And then they'll learn, through sciences, they'll learn what that's based on, why that happens. But even before we go to school, our brain begins to learn and observe and learn to form models, simple models of the world. So that's something we're able to do. Sophisticated rituals, superstition, even irrationality. This is something that our brain does have. For example, and this was more common in prehistory, before we had light bulbs. So daytime and nighttime was something that was very unique throughout most of human history, because at nighttime the world became very dark, and depending on the moon or the stars, you had very little light sometimes to see things. And if you did have light, those lights may cast shadows. And so when people were moving about you, these things that we didn't understand, which now we understand as shadows, but back then we didn't necessarily understand what a shadow was, that it was formed by light. There were a lot of superstitions around that. There were a lot of superstitions around accidental occurrences. And these are patterns of behavior that our brain does. Our brain is a pattern matching organ. It's a pattern matching system. And so ritual superstitions and even irrationality, these are simply cognates of patterns, of observed patterns that we see around us. So this is something that it does. Planning and prediction. And so this list is going down in terms of more and more sophistication. So as we go down this list, we see more sophisticated behaviors in brains. Planning and prediction is something that we learn to do, and especially after a certain age, because an infant that's born, that's 2 months old, is not going to do much planning and prediction, versus a child that's maybe 5 or 8 years old can do some planning. It probably cannot do much prediction. The extent of the prediction may be that Santa Claus will come, once a year and give presents, or their birthday will come and they'll get presents on their birthday. So that's the form of prediction that they'll be able to do, because they're told that on an annual basis, something called a year, they'll get presents. And adults can do much more complex planning and prediction. And lastly, we have the ability to theorize. And these are abstract models, very, very complex understanding of the world, and even hypothetical concepts of the world. So this gets into things that are very, very unique and human-like. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about today is that, most people think that the human brain is very special, and they have this idea that the human brain has all of these abilities. But the truth is that many animals have many of the same abilities. Okay. And while all of these 5 characteristics are human traits, the truth is that most of these, at least 4 of these, 4 of these are also traits of vertebrate animals also. Most of the complex large vertebrate animals have many of these same traits. Although not necessarily a single animal shows all of them like we do, although we haven't studied them in the ways that we have studied humans. So we really shouldn't say that no animal has all of these traits. But we've seen, for example, tool making in many types of animals, from birds, porpoises to octopus, many in primates, obviously. Cognitive adaptation, learning, ritual, superstition, these are in primates, definitely, and in other animals. Planning and prediction also we see in birds and some of the larger primates. Ability to theorize we don't see anywhere else yet. But though we can't say that it does not exist, though it would be very rudimentary if it did, we suspect. So basically, what I want to lay down the framework for here is that all of the behaviors that we see in the human brain are not unique to the human brain. Brains of many animals actually show many of the same characteristics that the human brain shows. The difference is that the human brain is larger on a mass level than other animal brains. So a bird's brain is obviously smaller. Relative to its body size, it's not that small. It's only a little bit smaller than a human brain relative to our body size. Porpoises actually have brains larger than their body size. So in that sense, they, in theory, may have more capability than even the human brain in some of these areas, though we don't study porpoises that much, so we really don't know. So I want to make sure that people recognize this, that the human brain is not a special thing. It's not something that is above any other brain. It's just that we have a larger brain. So because of the number of neurons in our brain, that's actually what gives us the sophistication. If we had a bird or if we had a dog that had a brain larger, it would show very similar, we suspect it would show very similar traits than what a human's brain does. Continuing on this, our nervous system creates all of the behaviors that we see. Okay? So there's nothing else in our body or outside of our body that drives the behavior that we see from our brain. So there's nothing magical about it. We don't have any extracorporeal forces that are required. Now, and some people have talked about quantum forces and quantum carriers being involved in parts of our brain. From a neuroscientist point of view, that's not necessary. One way to look at this is that we are able to explain everything that we've looked at so far at the brain, every behavior that we've analyzed in depth. And we have not analyzed everything, we have not looked in depth at everything, but the things that we have tried to look at, we've been able to explain them using the basic forces of science. So molecular forces and the laws of biochemistry, chemistry, biology, physics, these have completely explained to date pretty much everything that we see in the nervous system in our brain. So there's no reason for us to believe that there's anything else outside of our brain that is acting to make our brain do the things that it does. So that's something I think is important to understand. Lastly, neuroscientists see the brain as a complex machine. Now, some of you probably won't like to hear this or won't necessarily agree with it, but the brain is seen as a now as a machine. But we're scientists don't say that it's a machine like the machines that we have around us. It's much more complicated than any other machine we have. It's one of the most complicated things that we can envision that we can actually grapple with, that we can study. But what's meant by a complex machine is that the brain is a deterministic machine in the sense that it operates on deterministic principles. It operates on simple rules that come to play, and these rules magnify over many billions of neurons and many brain regions. Several dozen brain regions. They magnify over clusters. So all of the different rules that we have understood that control or affect behavior in the brain, we understand that the interactions, and this is where we have to look at it from a systems point of view, the interactions of the different regions of the brain, the interactions of the different types of neurons, the interactions of the networks of neurons, the interconnections between them, the various types of neurotransmitters that a brain has. Brain has multiple neurotransmitters. All of these types of things acting together behave like a machine. We're not saying it's a mechanistic machine like a car is. It is a biological machine, but the word machine here refers to it follows principles of science just as any other machine does. So this is where I want to go into complexity of the brain, because this is really what drives a lot of the neurosciences, because neuroscience is trying to find the simpler aspects around and out of all of this complexity. When a brain study is being done, there are so many things that are happening inside the various participants' brains that it's very difficult to tune out all of the extraneous information and focus on just the aspect that we're interested in looking at. It's very difficult to do that. So this complexity is a major part of the neurosciences. So what I'll do now is go into some of the complexity that is in the brain. So physical structures. So the brain is composed of neurons. So the cells, the neuron is a cell, which is the simplest type of cell that, well, actually I shouldn't say simplest. It's the simplest type of energy carrying cell that the brain has. But it's the most important cell that carries information flowing through the brain and through our nervous system. So the physical structures that these neurons are matrixed within, that they're formed within, those are important. Then there are many types of molecules also. Actually, before molecules, let me finish on cells. So the neurons are one type of cell. There are also other types of cells called glial cells. I mean, there are many types of glial cells, which are their support structures in the brain. They help provide nutrition to neurons. They help form the immunologic barrier. So the blood-brain barrier, some of you may have heard of. They also form the structural network, the physical structure of the brain, of almost the glue, you could say, that holds neurons in place, that makes sure that they don't move around or get damaged. So glial cells are very important as part of that. So the physical structures, then the cells, and lastly, the molecules. There are many types of molecules that are moving around in the brain and in our nervous system. Some of the simplest molecules are ions. Ions are basically an electrically charged atom or a molecule. We also have neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters may be very small ions, or they may be larger molecules. They may be neuropeptides, which are protein chains or peptide chains. So there are many types of molecules that are used to transport primarily information. They're used for signaling between neurons and between structures of the brain. And also there are molecules of respiration. So for example, oxygen when we're breathing, and CO2 from metabolism when our brain neuronal cells, glial cells, when they respirate, when they metabolize, because they need energy just like any other cell in the body. The Krebs cycle is active also in all of the cells in the brain. So those molecules of O2, CO2, and all of the other different molecules of metabolism also get carried among the regions of the brain, interstitial fluids, and then they get flushed out into the bloodstream and then back out into the body outside the brain. So there's many aspects to that. So the structure of the brain and the complexity is driven by multiple layers in specific brain regions. So the neocortex, for example, that's the most recent part of the brain. That's the most important part of the human brain. Actually has multiple layers. We believe it has 5 to 6 layers. Some neuroscientists believe it may be up to 7 or 8 layers. So it's exactly as it sounds. It's multiple layers, like layers in a cake. So the brain is the cortex, the cortical region of the brain has between 5 to 6 or possibly up to 8 different layers of brains. And within those layers, each of those layers have different topologies of neurons. Topologies are like formulations or networks of neurons. And so, for example, the topmost layer, some of the neurons actually help form a barrier to the brain. The layer below that has high density of certain types of neurons. Layers below that have different types of neurons. And all of the neurons, each of the neurons in the various layers have, we'll get into this in a subsequent slide, but they have projections. They have elements that reach out and connect to other neurons. So there are connections between all these layers between neurons. That's something important with the structure. Next, the average human brain has roughly 86 billion neurons. And this is actually, there was a study a few years ago that was done to assess this. They actually took many brains from human cadavers and they measured these, and it was a sophisticated way and it's fairly accurate. So this number is considered reliable, plus or minus a few billion. But the number you may have heard is 100 billion. That's where that number comes from. Is around 86 billion neurons in the human brain. That doesn't mean that there are only 86 billion cells, because the glial cells that we talked about that I mentioned are actually, there are about almost the same number of glial cells in the human brain also. The human brain actually has around 170 billion cells in it, which is a tremendous number of cells. Now, the unique thing to understand is that the brain has different regions in it. And you remember I mentioned that the brain has formed through evolutionary periods, through evolutionary epochs, it's formed different regions of the brain. And the density of neurons in the different regions of the brain vary. So some regions of the brain have very few neurons and they have more glial cells. Other regions of the brain have very few glial cells and many more neurons. The cerebellum is actually one of the older regions of the brain that actually has the highest density of neurons. And it's actually not a region that we understand very well compared to other regions. But interestingly, it's the most dense area of the brain. Thirdly, the interconnections of the brain. The interconnections are all of the, so neurons connect with other neurons, okay? And a neuron typically can connect to a single other neuron or maybe 1,000 other neurons. And all of these interconnections are done through projections. They're kind of like fibrous, almost hair-like organelles that grow out of the nucleus of the neuron. The neuron is a cell, so it has a nucleus. And out of that nucleus grows two structures called axons and dendrites. And in a later slide, we'll get into that. I won't get into that right now, but later slide, I'll describe this even more. But through these fiber-like projections, a neuron kind of almost touches its neighboring neurons. And these projections can be very, very long. Inside the brain, they're typically from millimeters to centimeters long. So you can have an axon that goes from one region of the brain, from the left hemisphere, across to the right hemisphere, and that may be 5 or 10 centimeters long, which is fairly long. And that's a single cell, we have to remember. A single cell, that length, is quite long. Now, the longest axons in the human body go from the brainstem, which is in our neck, just above our neck, down to our big toe. And in most humans, that's a single axon that goes through our spinal cord, from our brainstem through our spinal cord, through our leg, to our toe. That's a single cell. And in some people, that actually is broken in 2 or possibly even 3 cells. And that's through genetic diversity allows that to happen. But most people have that's longest axonal neuron in the human body. So it's almost 5 feet in length. It's a fairly long single cell. Other complexity in the brain are, we talked about neurotransmitters. There are many types of neurotransmitters. Some of you may have heard of dopamine, serotonin. There are actually many types of neurotransmitters, GABA transmitters. So neurotransmitters can work independently, and they can also work simultaneously. The next bullet says that neurotransmitters also, some of them act to excite another neuron, and other neurotransmitters act to inhibit other neurons. So you can have, if a neuron is communicating with a neighboring neuron, it can send a signal to the other neuron to activate it, to turn it on. Or it can send a signal using neurotransmitters, like for example, the GABA neurotransmitter is one that is inhibitory, it inhibits. So a neuron may send a set of your GABA neurotransmitters to its neighbor to inhibit, to prevent that neighbor neuron from firing. And so neurotransmitters, the complexity just of neurotransmitters alone allow a broad range of behaviors just within a very small space within the brain. And when you expand this across larger regions of the brain, within a brain region or across the entire brain, it becomes very, very complex. Another thing to explain is that neurotransmitters actually act on neurons, but they also act on glial cells. So glial cells is the last one that I'm talking about on this slide. So glial cells support neuronal formation and function, but they can also interfere with neuronal function and formation. For example, glial cells can actually capture certain neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are used to communicate from one neuron to another. So if a neurotransmitter gets sent out and a glial cell captures it, then the intent of that neuron doesn't happen. The glial cell kind of interfered in a way. So when you look at all of these different things happening all simultaneously across the 170 billion cells in a brain, right, you have extremely complex behaviors. So this slide should give you an understanding of all of the complexity that's underlying our nervous system, especially in our brain. So this is what makes it so difficult to study the brain and to derive simple rules that we can use to explain a lot of our behavior. So other aspects of this complexity are that our brain physiology, and some of these things I've talked about in previous talks, but our brain physiology, so the structure of our brain, the interconnections between neurons, these actually change over time. And learning does that. Learning can learning can promote the growth of neurons, but mostly it promotes the elongation of axons and the expansion of dendritic trees. So axons and dendritic trees are, remember I talked about those fibrous projections. And I think the subsequent slide will have a picture of that. It'll help people to see this. Actually, let me try to go there, see if we can actually now. It's a few slides away, sorry about that. So the axons and dendrites are fibrous projections out of a neuron. So those grow when we learn. So for example, when we learn, neurons interconnect with each other. And that those interconnections happen through axons extending or growing, and dendritic trees growing and extending. And I'll explain those again when we get to the slide. The slide is of the neuron is a few slides away. Also, neuroplasticity is something that some of you may have heard of. Neuroplasticity actually has several aspects to it. It has to do with the formation of new neurons. Now, this typically happens in youth. So when we're, especially in the first few years of life, most of the brains that are in the brain grow. And they keep growing, and they reach a maximum of around age 7. And after that, the number of neurons in the human brain actually starts decreasing. It decreases slightly up to about the age of 20, 25. And then from then on, it starts to decrease at a more rapid pace until we die. So age 7 is the point, around age 7 is the point at which we have the maximum number of neurons. But the number of neurons is not the most important aspect of what creates our behavior, the complexity in our behavior. It's actually the interconnections between these neurons. It's the axons of the dendrites, those projections, those fibrous projections. So that's the most important. So the second bullet here is the growth of the dendritic tree. And that is very important for neuroplasticity, or the ability for us to change what we know, change what we learn, change what our brain does, is that the dendritic tree actually does and can change over time. It can change by age, it can change through learning, and it can change through experiences, even well, experiences are a form of learning. Lastly, there's something called pruning, and this is a complex area of the brain, which I won't go too much into this, but pruning is where the brain itself cuts, or you can say prunes, parts of the dendritic tree, um, or some neurons may die, or it may kill off certain neurons in the brain. And these things happen through age naturally, but the brain may do this on its own at some times. And it also happens through diseases. There are certain diseases, especially, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 virus right now, which causes COVID-19, actually causes cellular death, including neuronal death. So, pruning is an important aspect of brain physiology. Another area of complexity is interneurons. And I talked about connections between neurons that are neighbors. Interneurons are some of those longer neurons which connect between regions of the brain. So for example, some of you have heard of the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. You may have heard of the hippocampus. And those are two regions that are adjacent to each other. They're fairly close to each other, but still they're not that close. They're a few centimeters apart. And typically neurons would not span that distance. So interneurons are special types of neurons which grow very, very long length, and they primarily connect between brain regions. So typically between, let's say, the amygdala and the hippocampus, for example, there would be probably millions of interneurons that allow the information to pass between each of those two regions of the brain. And likewise, any two regions of the brain would have millions, between thousands and millions of interneurons that allow information to flow between the brain, between those segments. So what's important, what I'm getting at here is that the brain is not simply a single organ. It's actually an organ consisting of smaller regions, smaller segments. And each of those segments has hundreds of millions of neurons within it. And all of those neurons are connected in various topologies. And then there are other neurons that connect that entire section of the brain, that region, to other regions of the brain and possibly even other regions of the body. So network connections between brain regions is quite complex. It gets really, really complicated. So I think let's do a break now and have some question and answers. Is that a good time?
Sounds good. Sounds good. So, folks, we've got about 60 people on the call. So, what we're going to do is we've got 4 rules that work beautifully for us. Number 1, type exclamation mark in order to ask questions. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. At this point, let's just take a few short questions. So keep them extremely short, after which we're going to go into breakout rooms. So we'll have plenty of time to discuss these ideas ourselves. Okay, so short question. So it's going to be Cotton followed by Rich. Cotton, go ahead.
Hi, so Sanjay, thank you so much. Wonderful. My question was, there's a lot of things out nowadays regarding like nutrition and the grain brain, all of these things. How do any kind of nutrition, like from your digestive system, impact the brain, and which part, what area from what you've described?
So the brain consists of cells, right? Glial cells and neural cells. Those are the two, pretty much most of the brain has these two types of cells. And it also has vascular cells, for example, for blood vessels and other things. But these glial cells and neural cells are the main elements of the brain that causes brain activity. Now, when we eat, there are multiple purposes for the food that we eat. One is most important purpose is energy, right? It produces basically glucose and lipids. These are forms of energy storage in biology that's used by our bodies. And these are passed on through our digestive system, through our bloodstream, circulatory system, into our brain. So one aspect of nutrition is simply providing energy to the brain cells so that they can live, they can metabolize, and they can function. Other areas of nutrition have to do with support molecules, for example, nutrients, micronutrients. There are actually many types of uh, uh, compounds and metals, even metals. For example, copper, potassium, sodium. These are all basically metals that are very much required in our body. Calcium, sodium, potassium are actually very, very important for the brain because they exist in the brain as ions, and they're the primary molecules that carry signal, that carry electrical signal across regions of the brain and the nervous system. So when we eat foods, the nutrients that we eat provide all of these types of elements. Also, there's another aspect to this, which we talked about neurotransmitters, and most people think that neurotransmitters exist only in the brain. That's not true. Neurotransmitters actually are created in, and they're used by other organs also. Our pancreas and digestive system actually uses certain neurotransmitters. The GABA neurotransmitter is something that's used in many other parts of our brain, of our body. And so nutrition helps to create these molecules. So basically, different parts of our body takes the food that we digest, breaks the food down because the food are they're organic molecules, and it breaks down the organic molecules into smaller structures, and different parts of our body puts them together into other molecules, into peptides, for example, proteins. This is one of the reasons why protein is important for our diet, because our body breaks down the proteins that we digest into smaller proteins and reformulates them into more complex other proteins that our body needs for building, for example, building muscles or building skin, other things. It also uses those enzymes and molecules to create neurotransmitters and other things. So there are a lot of molecules in our brain that basically come from our nutrition. That's the reason why nutrition is so important.
Thank you, Sanjay. So next up is going to be Rich, Laura, Kevin, Stephen, Jairo, Hugo, Ed, and Vanessa. So folks, please keep your questions brief. Rich, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Sanjay. Very interesting. I listened to a talk by a neuroscientist from Dartmouth on free will, and he was postulating that there were quantum mechanical effects associated with neurotransmitter distribution. You had mentioned that we didn't have to look at things like quantum mechanical aspects to understand the neuroscience of it. So I was just wondering if you're familiar with this, if you had any viewpoint on that type of postulated involvement in determining free will as opposed to pure determinism.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And this is one of those questions that's on the forefront in the field right now, because as we get more into ideas of consciousness and what exactly is thought and things like that. So like any other science, neuroscientists have to come up with theories to be at the forefront, to be recognized by their peers, to have visibility in the journals. So neuroscientists also come up with theories. And this is a theory that has been put forth by many neuroscientists and even people outside of the neurosciences. And it's one of those theories that cannot be proven or disproven at the moment. And there's no way to know for certain if there's any basis to it, or if in fact it is true, or if in fact if it's partially true. There's no way for us to know right now because quantum mechanics is something that we are still studying ourselves. But my personal view is that and this is what I put into the talk, is that at this point, there's no reason for us to suspect any other reason for consciousness and free will, or if free will exists or not is a different question. But the concept of free will and the concept of consciousness can be explained without having to resort to quantum mechanics. That's my personal view.
Thank you. Next up is Laura. Laura, what's your question? Laura, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
I got it. If Kevin's not there. I don't know. I can say that I'm probably a consumer of this area, neuroscience, neurology, the whole 9 yards. And in all the time I've dealt with doctors and so forth, I can tell you that they feel like they haven't even gotten close to understanding anything. It's a most complicated science. There's no answers for any of the questions they have. And all the things you talk about all have implications, but they can't really define anything concrete. There's no answer for it. And I can tell you, as a consumer, there surely isn't. It's a crapshoot, and that's all I'm going to tell you. And I listen to all these theories and all these measurements and all of this, but you know what? It doesn't come down, it doesn't do me any good to know all these facts, because it doesn't have any relationship to anything that I feel is human, actually. And I just want to say that. Sorry.
Fine, that's okay. So let me explain what your view on this. So neuroscience is a relatively new science compared to other sciences. Most of the other sciences have been around for hundreds of years. And neuroscience is around for about 50 to 80 years, where it really started to do research and started to find, generate its own findings. So it's a relatively new science. Also, one of the reasons why I went into the complexity of the brain is I wanted people to understand why it's so difficult right now for us to be able to come up with rules that govern complex behavior, because complex behavior is driven at so many different levels. And what in neuroscience, what is possible today is to understand at simpler levels many of the things that are happening inside the brain. But when we try to extrapolate to more complex human behaviors, for example, behaviors in personality, that neuroscience cannot do today. And it probably will not do that for a few decades. But eventually it will. Eventually it will be able to understand and predict a lot of our behavior. But this is something that it is a developing science still. Now, yeah. When you go to a typical physician is not trained in neuroscience, so they probably won't have the knowledge that a neuroscientist will. And even a neurologist is not necessarily working on at the forefront. Neurologist, a medical doctor is different from a neuroscientist.
I know.
So I want you to understand that if you go to a neurologist is working on practicable techniques that can be used in medicine. And remember, medicine is something that they do anything that harms the patient. So there are a lot of restrictions in medicine. So there are a lot of knowledge that in neuroscience is known, but it cannot be practiced in medicine today because there's no way to apply those to
I understand.
Right. Let's do Laura. There are about 10 people in line for questions. Let everybody ask their questions, and then we will have chance to talk about this in the breakout rooms and our takeaways. Okay. Next up is going to be Kevin, Stephen, Jairo, Hugo, Joe, Rojin, and Jean. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you. It's good learning from you, Sanjay. And my question is regarding to we say the neurosciences, the treat of brain is like a complex machine. Could be computer. We know when we computer, we have operator ourselves. We can do it. Who is operator for our neural system? Then how much power we can control this neural system. The term is like self-control. Which part we can control, which part we don't. But for example, our digest system, it don't need much, control. What you eat, they can digest themselves. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so your question is actually very complicated because at the heart of it, our brain does a lot of things that we're not aware of. So when you talk about the digestive system, the control of the digestive system is actually very complicated. The brain does, but we're not aware of it, so we don't realize that. The same way, a lot of what happens inside our brain, we're not conscious of either. If you talk to most psychologists and psychiatrists, they'll tell you that most behavior, most activity in the brain occurs at subconscious levels that we're not aware of. So for the average person to know what's happening inside their brain, it's extremely difficult. But through many types of studies, imaging studies and other types of studies, we can access, we can form not just images, but form complex understanding of what's happening inside the brain and how information is flowing within the brain to cause things to happen. Lastly, you asked about what's controlling the brain. You talked about comparing it to a machine. It's not that anything outside is controlling the brain. The brain is controlling itself. You can think of it as the brain is an organ which the electrical signals, it operates within information, within electrical signals, biochemical signals. And the biochemical signals are moving within it in various formations. And the movement of those signals, of that energy, is what causes it to keep operating. As long as the brain cells, the neurons, keep having energy, through food and respiration, as long as our brain cells are alive, they will keep interacting and sending signals amongst each other. And all of those interactions are what causes it to function. There's nothing outside of the brain that causes it to function.
Okay. Next up is Stephen, Jairo, and Hugo. Stephen?
So Sanjay, I want to help defend you here. If you cut off a chicken's head, the chicken still runs, and there are neurological reasons for that. If you can understand a car and how it works, but you put a race car driver in there, and a good driver can overcome a lousy car. But if the driver knows how the car works, things go better. So let me just say that we're discussing the car here, not the driver. And I have 3 quick questions. You said the brain developed between 1 to 4 million years ago. What about the AMH, the anatomically modern human beings that appeared around Cro-Magnon, appeared about 200,000 years ago? Is there a difference between those brains?
Okay, let's go with that question, okay?
All right, cool.
There are differences in brain. The main differences from the 1 to 4 million years ago that I mentioned was the neocortex formation. That's the outermost, most recent region of the human brain, of the primate brain, you can say. So development of brain among hominids and primates was in the prefrontal cortex, the cortical regions, they enlarged, the cranial cavity enlarged, the physical size of the brain enlarged. Those are the main changes that I'm aware of.
Okay, great. So folks, just one question per person and no follow-up, so that way we can go through as many people as possible. So it's going to be Jairo, Hugo, Ed, Vanessa, Joe, Regine, Jean, and James. So Jairo, go ahead. What's your question?
Thank you. Is a ganglion made up of pretty much the same type of cells found in the brain?
So ganglia are, I talked about 2 types of cells in the brain, neurons and ganglia. So ganglia are, there's more than one type of ganglia in the brain. And ganglia, one type of ganglia are astrocytes. There are also microganglia. There are, there's I think a endomyelium. I don't remember the exact, all of the different types. There are roughly 4 types of major ganglia in the brain, in the human, in animal brains. And they provide various support structures. For example, I mentioned this, that microganglia are responsible for immune function and providing nutrients. astrocytes provide they provide interstitial fluids. They also support nutrition. And the other two types of ganglia help to form a rigid matrix within which the neurons reside, so that they're not disturbed, they're not moved, or the interconnections with other neurons aren't broken. So it's a physical structure also. So ganglia provide a lot of the non-information based aspects of the brain.
Next up is Hugo. Hugo, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Shrikant, and thanks, Sanjay, for the great presentation. Actually, I have two questions, if you don't mind. My first question is, you may have hinted earlier on, but it's about the nature of consciousness from the neuroscience perspective. And my second question is, what are your thoughts about the benefits of meditation on the brain? Thank you.
So consciousness, we'll talk about that in a subsequent talk. I'll defer that for later. If you're interested, then definitely tune into that. I think that's this coming Saturday. We're going to have a talk on that.
Yes, it's going to be this Saturday at what time is what was it? I forgot now.
12:30, I think.
12:30, yeah.
Eastern time.
12:30 Eastern time. All right.
And the question on mindfulness, that we had earlier talks on that. So if you want to go back and look at that, but mindfulness is beneficial in general.
Excellent. So it's going to be now Ed, Vanessa, Joe, Rogine, Jean, James, Jyoti, Jeff, Clara, and Priya. Sanjay, so many questions. So let's try to keep the answers also brief. So folks, keep the questions and answers brief. I want to go through all of them. I think it's important. These are fantastic questions. I want to cover as much area as possible, but keep it brief. All right. So next up is Ed.
Yeah, great presentation, Joe. We've been studying Alzheimer's for the last 50 years, and psychopharmacologists really haven't been able to determine too much. We know aluminum deposits and neurofibrillary tangles. Is there any new research to determine before autopsy that we can make a differential diagnosis between Alzheimer's versus just dementia based on on other issues?
I mean, I have not studied Alzheimer's specifically, but I do know that Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases, a lot of the recent findings are that different types of plaque, for example, amyloid plaques and tau plaques, tau proteins, they're a form of, they're a metabolite. They're a byproduct of normal metabolism in neural cells. And what happens is that there are chironic versions of these proteins, mirror images basically. And once these mirror images forms of these proteins develop in a person's brain, they cause a cascade which causes all of the normal tau and amyloid proteins to be disrupted, to be turned into the bad kind. So once you start to have one or a few of these bad, mirror image type of proteins, they seem to cause all of the normal proteins to also flip over and become the reverse image. And that's what causes neuronal death. That's my understanding of a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases.
Next up is Vanessa. Vanessa, what's your question?
Yeah, I got an easy one. 7th grade question here. Is this more like for the primitive brain, how like gullible and susceptible it is to senses like, the score of Jaws, dun, dun, like if psycho movies or like if you paint warm colors in something, it may be common. Is that something maybe comparable to animals with less complex, maybe more primitive brains? They may have the similar reaction. Like, is that more like a survival or flight things? Because you got to react real quickly. So is that more primitive part of our brain? That makes any sense?
Yeah. So I mean, for example, when we hear the Jaws theme, the music in the Jaws movie, or anything that's scary or evokes a strong emotional reaction, that is primarily activating our limbic system, which is one of the earlier parts of one of the more primordial parts of our brain. Yeah, so animals can have, not necessarily to the Jaws music, but they can have similar reactions to emotional stimuli.
Next up is Joe, Rogine, and Jean. Joe?
Hey, Sanjay, great presentation. Just a really quick question. You said, you mentioned about graph theory being used to analyze the brain. Do you have a specific example there, how their graph theory is being used?
So this is more in the modeling side of neurosciences, and also it's actually not necessarily just in the neurosciences, it's also in the neural network side of engineering. But graph theory is primarily used to model different topologies within the brain. One of the challenges with the brain, and what we're starting to see, is that, and I went into this a little bit. I didn't go in detail because it's probably not going to make sense to a lot of people. But when we talk about the different regions of the brain and different layers within the cortex, the structure of the neurons, the topology of the structure of the neurons vary across in very, very different ways. The interconnections of those neurons vary in a lot of different ways. So graph theory is a tool, is a mathematical tool that's being used in some areas of computational neuroscience to model those aspects of the brain. It's very early though. It's trying to see if we can, by forming these models, these early models, we're trying to see if we can create models that replicate what we actually see in living non-human brains. Usually they're in more primitive brains that they're starting with.
Next up is Rogine, Jean, and James. Rogine, go ahead.
Yeah, this maybe is a quick question. Where does DNA fit into this?
So DNA is a molecule that's used in cell replication. So every cell that divides, and most every cell that divides that has a nucleus, it makes a copy of itself. And DNA is, you can think of DNA as a program that helps the cell to one, make a copy of itself, and then after the copy is made, it helps the cell to do whatever whatever type of cell it is. So if you look at a composite organism, like a human being is a very complex organism. We have, several hundred different types of cells, but each of those types of cells know what to do by reading certain segments of the DNA that's in its nucleus. And so the DNA is a program. You can think of it as a program. It's a complex program, but it's a program that tells the cell how to behave and how to go about how to survive, how to stay alive, basically.
Next up is Jean.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. You mentioned how the cell extended from the back of your brain all the way to the foot. So it reminded me about, in China, we do a lot of like foot massage. We try to treat different illness through massage certain part of your foot. And I think, what do you think about if neuroscience study will help to explain how Chinese medicine work? Because it's experiential based. So it's not really have theory based, it's experience based, but it really works. I think they treat the body holistically because it's all interconnected, versus Western medicine is more like where you have problem and look at that part. But I think maybe this help, the study will really help to explain why Chinese medicine work. What do you think?
There have been studies that look at Chinese medicine and other types of alternative medicine. So first, I'll just quickly say that when I describe the peripheral nervous system, the peripheral nervous system is in some ways similar to what Chinese medicine and acupuncture, these fields, what they do. They try to look at the terminal points of a lot of our nerves and try to excite those. For example, acupuncture is trying to excite different nerves throughout our body. And in a sense, what it does when it does that is it's sending signals, it's sending information, usually it's pain or some type of excitatory signal to parts of our brain. So that part is accurate. The part about whether that can actually cause changes in emotions or changes in brain function, that's a part that I'm not sure is necessarily accepted by neuroscience. There may be actually placebo effects that come into play there, or other aspects of the person believing or wanting to believe that the medicine is helping them. So there are a complex set of situations that are occurring together, not just the stimulation across their body that the Chinese medicine practitioner is doing.
Next up is James, Jyoti, and Jeff. James.
Hi, Sanjay. My question is that when I look at neurons, I see a cellular structure that I don't recognize elsewhere in nature. I see a cellular structure that looks a little bit like worms, but it's actually much more random. It looks like maybe worms in the middle of a movement, in the middle of in the middle of movement, and there's a kind of a randomness to it, and I'm wondering if there isn't what the current theory about the development of the organization of neurons and dendrites and so forth, if there isn't a kind of like an adaptation of a random process to the final solutions in the development of the functions in the brain. What do you think, Sanjay?
So I think when you're talking about worms, you're probably talking about the axons. In one of the later slides, I'll show a simple picture of a neuron. So probably you're talking about axons, because that's it's a long segment that protrudes from the nucleus of a neuron. So one thing to understand is axons don't necessarily move. It's not like as worms move. So I want to explain, worms move, but neurons don't really move. I mean, they over time they can migrate, but that's a different function. Normally they don't move. Once they're formed, they're stationary, and they only transduct signal. As far as the signal transduction, though, it's unidirectional, mostly unidirectional. It goes from the nucleus out through the axon and into the neighboring neurons that the axon terminates into. And then the dendrites from one or more neighboring neurons would collect signals, neurotransmitters and electrical ions, and channel them into their nucleus. And then nucleus would consolidate it and send it out of their axon. So it's a very simple model, actually, if you look at it. I don't have any videos today, but I talked about possibly doing a part 2 here. But if we feel it's important to do that, that's something that I can pull up.
I was interested in
Next
their
up,
growth.
just a second. Let's give a chance for everybody to ask as many questions. Next up is going to be Jyoti, Jeff, and Clara. Jyoti.
Yeah, hi. Sanjay, as usual, it was a great presentation. What is your opinion about the article that I sent you, that all the thinking does not take place in the brain? The body has something to do with it, and brain gets the message, and it helps you to relieve the tension that is going on in your body, but that tension is not necessarily coming from the brain. For example, the drinking of water, thirst, and gastrointestinal problem a person could have, and that could be as a result of bad digestion or bad divorce, but the brain knows how to heal it. So did you pay attention to why the thinking is not always taking place in the brain, and what makes the body also think?
Okay, so I didn't get the message email that you sent me. If it was recently, I haven't been able to check. I was not able to check my email today at all, very rarely. So, but what you described, let me quickly try to explain. So I described that the brain is connected into pretty much most of the important areas of our body, and the brain always has access to and is always monitoring, in a sense. It's always monitoring our body through the peripheral nervous system. And what happens in our body does impact our brain and our emotions and feelings. But I would say, I mean, you're using the term to say that there are thoughts outside of our brain. I wouldn't use it to describe that. I wouldn't say there are thoughts. There are sensations outside of our brain. There are sensations that our brain can sense and they migrate. So for example, you said in digestion, so in our stomach or digestive system, if there are sensations, they would migrate through our peripheral nervous system, through our spinal cord, through our brainstem into the more complex brain. And depending on what state of mind we're in, it may go in different areas and do different things. So definitely the brain and body are very much interlinked, and they operate together. Hopefully I answered your question.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Sanjay, thank you for this remarkable presentation, for the gift of it to us. I saw in your kind of progression or evolution of functions there that predicting the future was high on the list. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, you know, sort of beyond theory to the ability to accurately or adequately predict the future. How has neuroscience learned about that, and or what has neuroscience learned about that, and how we might improve our ability to do it?
So in one of the slides I mentioned the word predict, but I wasn't talking specifically about predicting the future. I was talking about predicting things based on events that have happened. So for example, the example that I gave is a 5-year-old might predict that they'll get their birthday present at their next birthday. That's a form of prediction. In a sense, it is predicting the future, but it's not predicting the future as most of us think of as Nostradamus predicting what will happen in 1,000 years. Neuroscience doesn't talk about that. It's a simpler form of prediction based on information that we know of, that we have a model based on, and we can extrapolate that model to predict what might happen.
Next up is Clara. Clara, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My question is about the neuroscience of language. And you said, if I'm to understand correctly, you said that babies perceive, but they don't necessarily perceive in language. So I guess my question is, what has science or neuroscience taught us about what's going on with perception and how we, how, if language is involved in that or not? Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, perception, when I talk about, or when a neuroscientist in general talks about perception, it's at a very basic level. It's not, they're not talking about the more advanced processes that happen inside the brain. Perception at its core is simply the translation of, I mean, there's different ways I can explain it. The simplest way to explain it is something outside of the body that's happening gets translated and then is inside the brain in a very specific region of the brain. So for example, when we see something outside in the world, it gets translated through our eyes, through our visual system, into the visual cortex, into the back of our brain. And there are, at the lowest level, they're just simply ideas, you might say image type ideas that form. But then those would form, they would develop much more in complex ways and go throughout the brain and form. So the same thing with language. We're talking about reading text on a page. If reading text on a page, the brain initially would simply have an image of the text. It would not translate it into language at that point. The language centers of the brain are different from the visual centers. They are tied together. They do communicate, but language processing is much more complicated. We might do a talk on that later on. It's a very important topic, but it's a very advanced thing. I can't really explain it in a few minutes, but it's an excellent question.
Yeah, I would love to do one on language. That's amazing. Now, Rocky had a question. They asked me to read it out. Say, you spoke briefly about diet and the effects of micro and macronutrients. Can you speak to what neuroscience has learned about the effects of fat on brain development in infancy and the myelin sheath, and how low-fat diets may affect the adults or aging brains?
Yeah, so this is important. Now, I have not studied specifically nutrition as related to the brain, but what I do understand is that, so let me explain this, that every cell in the human body, pretty much every cell in the human body needs fat to develop and to stay existent, because the outer sheath of every cell, the cellular membrane, is formed by lipid molecules. Lipid is basically a type of fat. It's a simple fat molecule. And the myelin sheath is, myelin sheaths are extremely important, and there are other types of sheaths also, not just myelin, but myelinated sheaths. They act as a covering across the axonal part of nerves. And especially in the peripheral nervous system and within the brain, they're very, very important because what they do is they cause signals to travel much faster. And myelin has a high fat content. So it is true that, and I suspect that because we need a lot of fat to create myelin sheaths, I suspect that infants and babies would need a lot of fat in their diet. That's one of the reasons why doctors say never give skim milk to infants, under a certain age. Typically you should give whole milk or as much, full fat as you can to babies.
Thank you. Last question is from Priya, and then we're going to do the breakout rooms. Steph, your question we'll deal with in the next round. Priya, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. My question is, I am curious about if you could elaborate on when our brain function is impaired, cognitive functionality is impaired during the activation of the limbic system. Like what's happening in our entire body and mind that impairs us from thinking straight, clearly, to even blacking out or speaking, or all sorts of impairment. Like if you can describe like what's happening in a chemical.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a complex set of cascades that happen. So I'll have to do it very, very simply. Again, we might do another talk on that at some point. But so the limbic system, so our brain, when we experience something with outside world that is troubling, that is scary, let's say, right, that causes trauma or stress, that information goes into many different parts of our brain. It goes into our thinking part of our brain, which is the neocortex, specifically the prefrontal cortex. It also goes into the limbic system, primarily the amygdala. And it goes in all of those places almost simultaneously. But the limbic system activates first because by the design of our brain through evolution has made it very, very fast acting. We talk about system 1, system 2 activation. The system was, Daniel Kahneman wrote a book about this, but this is something that's real in the brain, is that the limbic system is very fast acting because one of the main purposes for it is to identify threats to us, survival threats, as fast as it can, so that we can move out and go to safety. So the limbic system is activated almost immediately, very, very fast, within a few milliseconds. And that happens long before the prefrontal cortex even realizes. So for example, you might notice something, you might notice that you're walking through a forest, and you might notice that there's a snake on the ground somewhere. Well, your neocortex probably will not realize that there's a snake, that you have seen a snake, but your limbic system will realize there's a snake, and you might have a feeling of anxiety or stress or panic even, because your limbic system has noticed something that appears to be a snake. Now, the other side of it is that it might just be a twig that appears to be a snake, but your limbic system doesn't care. Its purpose is to get you out of danger, even if it's a false danger, right? So what happens is the limbic system immediately, it makes assumptions. It sends information based on those assumptions to other parts of our brain, and for our autonomic nervous system, it might activate adrenaline and other steroids, and it will activate your body to basically do the fight or flight response. It will prepare you to either run or fight or whatever you need to survive. And in the meantime, one of the things that it's also doing is it's shutting down the blood flow to parts of your body that it considers less important. Now, one of the things that it does is it considers the prefrontal cortex less important. It considers the thinking brain less important. So it actually shuts down or reduces blood flow to that part of the brain. And that's the reason why when we get into that state, we're not able to think ourselves out of that, because our thinking part of the brain is actually shut down partly during that moment. And reactivation of our cortex takes time. It cannot be done quickly. It takes time. So the best way to learn not for that not to happen is to prevent the activation of the limbic system, which is difficult.
Excellent. Thank you, Sanjay. So now next, we are going to do breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. I'm going to shorten it so we have time for the second presentation. In the breakout rooms, I recommend that please allow everybody who wants to share talk about 2 minutes about whatever observations that they have, and then have a short discussion. And then we will be back for the second presentation, followed by more Q&A and breakout rooms, starting the breakout rooms now.
Screen sharing. All right, so we'll go into networks. So this is the next part of the talk, and we talked about a lot of the brain, and the most important aspect of the brain that causes a lot of the complicated behavior is that the brain is a network of neurons, an interconnected network of neurons, and also it's a interconnection of brain regions. So it's interconnections at many levels. Also, it's interconnection with the body, but I won't go into that right now. So brain is a network of neurons. So what makes a network? So a network has a number of neurons. In the brain, it's around 86 billion in the human brain. A network has a certain density of neurons. So in the human brain, the density of neurons vary by brain region. So in some brain regions, it has a very low density. Density is the given amount of space. So if you had let's say 1 centimeter cubic volume, the number of neurons that would fit into that space, into that volume. And in some brain regions, the volume of neurons is very, very low. It might be only 100,000 in that region. Actually, it would be more than 100,000. It would be only on the order of a few million. In other regions of the brain, you might have close to 800 or 900 million in that volume of space in a cubic centimeter. So the volume of neurons can vary tremendously across the human brain. The degree of connectedness is another area of a network. And this is, see, these ideas are very difficult. I mean, I wanted to have videos or I do have some images, but the images really, I don't think we'll get into that in the next few slides, but we'll try to do videos later on so we can explain some of these concepts, because it's very difficult to explain this just using words and just using simple images. But the degree of connectedness is the amount of connections that one neuron has with other neurons. But when you're talking about a single neuron, it's fairly easy to see that one neuron can be connected to one other neuron, it may be connected to 50 other neurons, or 1,000 other neurons, right? That you can see and understand. But if you had, let's say, a matrix of 1,000 neurons, the interconnectedness between all of them can occur in many different ways. For example, the simplest way is if you had 1,000 neurons, and let's make this into a very simple structure, 10 by 10 by 10 grid. Okay, so three-dimensional cube of a 10 across by 10 wide by 10 deep. Okay, that would give you 1,000 neurons. If every single neuron was interconnected, every single neuron, it would be a very, very complicated and very dense set of structure, right? That would be the maximum set of connectedness in that network. But you can also have a network where the outermost neurons connect to every other neuron, but the inner neurons hardly connect at all, right? That's another type of connectedness. You can have another connectedness where just a few neurons, very, very few neurons connect to many neurons, and most neurons connect to, let's say, 100 neurons, right? So let's say you might have 10 neurons that connect to all of the other 1,000 neurons, or 990 other neurons, and you have 100 neurons that connect to, at most, only 100 other neurons. So this degree of connectedness, there can be a wide range of attributes, of topologies in how these networks can be formed. So that's another aspect of how neurons can interconnect. And over time and over age and over the type of information that we learn, the connectedness of neurons do vary, and within brain regions, they do vary. But overall, in the human brain, neurons don't connect completely, because that would make it very problematic, because if every neuron was connected to every other neuron, then anytime a neuron fires, it would in effect cause all of the other neurons in that region to activate in some sense. And you probably don't want that. What gives the power of a network is in something called the state of the network, right? And there's a video that I had in one of the earlier presentations that showed it, and I'll try to do that later on. But the state of a network is a very important concept, and the degree of connectedness is related to that. Another aspect of networks is that we have neurotransmitters that are released to communicate between these networks. So the types of connections is one thing, that's the degree of connectedness, but the types of information. So for example, if you have a connection between two different neurons, you can have multiple types of information flowing between those neurons because you have multiple neurotransmitters. One type of neurotransmitter would be excitatory, meaning it would excite its neighboring neurons. Another type of neurotransmitter would be inhibitory, and the different types of neurotransmitters would be excitatory at different levels and to different parts of the neighboring neurons. So because there are different types of neurotransmitters, you can have a lot of complex transmission just along a single path, along a simple connection path between two neurons. You can have multiple types of excitations or inhibitions between two neurons. And glial cells also act within this. So the network of neurons is complex, and it has so many different types of behaviors that can happen. So this is, again, within just a single set of neurons. So I have two very simple images. Here we have just 6 neurons, and this is one example of how they can all be connected together, right? So at the bottom center is one neuron that's connected to 4 other neurons. That has the most connectedness.
We're still on the previous slide, so could we move to the image? I don't see the image. Oh, there. Okay, sorry, got it.
Okay, so it's just, I don't know, I'm not sure what's showing right now, but so we have 2 different types of neural clusters. The one on the left shows a sparse network of neuron connections, right? So Shrikant, are we seeing 2 different, okay. So on the left, we see a sparse network. On the right, we see something that's maximally connected. Every neuron is connected to every other neuron, right? And the one on the left, we see that the neuron on the bottom left corner, the bottom center corner, is connected to 4 other neurons. And if you look at the leftmost neuron, it's connected to only 1 other, right? So the interconnections are not very sophisticated. But that actually is a type of connectedness that we want in a brain, because that gives a sophistication of signaling, because the neuron that's in the bottom actually has more effect on all of the other neurons than in the right-hand graph, because in the right-hand graph, if any neuron activates, it causes everything else to light up. There's very little differentiation. It's almost like the same thing happens no matter what neuron activates. It causes the same thing to happen in the entire circuit. And that's not very interesting. So the left side of the network is actually more interesting. That's actually how our brain is. It's actually a sparsely connected network. And what we want is we want connections between. So if you think of the left network as one brain region, the right as a different brain region, we actually have interconnections between these brain regions also. So the one neuron, in this case, we have only a few neurons, but in the reality, left region will have, let's say, 1 million neurons, and the right region might have 50 million neurons. And these interconnected lines, these thick lines in the middle, there might be like 50,000 lines interconnected between them. And those 50,000 lines would pass information from, if one is the auditory center of a brain and the other is the prefrontal cortex, what might happen is that when you hear a sound, the auditory centers would activate, and it would start to recognize, to some sense, the tonal qualities of the sound. So, the language that you're familiar with, if it's English, the phonemes of the English language, of the English sound system, would be recognized by that part of the brain. And these interconnections between that part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex would carry more advanced meaning of the sound that you heard. The sound that you heard might sound like a word, okay, like cat. And if you hear the word cat, then those 50,000 interconnections between these 2 regions of the brain would, in some sense, carry the concept of this tonal sound of a cat into the prefrontal cortex, which might activate, for example, the thought of a cat. So when you hear the word cat, through sound, it will conjure the idea of a cat in your mind. This is a simple example of how interconnections are important in the brain. So this is what's known as a connectome. The connectome is a wiring diagram of the brain. And on the left is an actual connectome. This is from MRI. This is not the full connectome of the human brain, by the way. This is a very limited picture of just some of the connectome of the human brain. Full connectome would be so thick that it would be almost like a completely dense, forest. You would not be able to see individual lines. But the left image is based on actual MRI scans, multiple scans of the one brain, and it shows many different types of connections. The rightmost image is a similar representation from a different from the frontal aspect. So you're looking face on to the person. Now the middle image is actually not of the brain. The middle image is a representation of the internet in the year 2005, and it's an image of the interconnections between the internet. And I put this here because I wanted to show people that networks can be very complicated, and the way that the brain interconnects is not that different from how very complex networks, how very complex real-world networks interconnect. And if you look at the interconnections in the center image, in the internet, the World Wide Web image, you'll see there are clusters that are very, very dense. You'll see clusters that are very sparse. You'll see areas which are almost like bright white dots, right? Those are very extremely concentrated clusters, and the brain has very similar topologies also. So the real world, this is why network theory and graph theory and network science gets into it. It actually does explain a lot of our brain, though. Those are the more advanced areas of neuroscience which are in its infancy, and those are not able to give us advanced understanding of human behavior, of advanced behavior, for example, personality. But these are tools that we're developing that over time, over decades, will help us to do a lot more sophisticated modeling and such. This is two simple images of the connection between the brain. And again, the left side is a simpler representation where there are multiple segments of the brain that are activated, and each of those segments of the brain have this, a gray circle, but that gray circle really represents, you might say, hundreds of thousands or even millions of neurons, okay? And they all activate together. And then the one line or one or the few lines, gray lines that emanate out of the gray circles are these interneuronal connections between regions of the brain. And it's not just one neuron that connects, it's tens of thousands, maybe even millions of connections between brain regions. And at the top of the brain region in the left side, we see 3 yellow circles. And that may be representing something, because the top region is the cortical region of the brain, and the centermost region is more the midbrain and the more primitive parts of the brain. So this may be a representation of where emotions arise in a person. And those emotions go into the awareness part of their brain, and they become aware of the feelings that they're having. So this might be, for example, hypothetically, it might be that you're feeling anxious about something that's happening, or maybe you feel nauseous that something you ate, and you're having awareness of feeling nausea. That could be left side of the brain. The right image is, again, it's representational, but it's, I don't remember if this is a PET scan or not, but it's neuroimaging, and this is not a human brain. I don't remember what animal brain it is, but it's showing the activation in different regions of the brain, and they tried to do this in different colors. So you see the green is information that's flowing between some region, the blue is information between different regions, and then the red is, if you see very, very thin red strands, those are connections between different regions of the brain. So this is a example. These two images are examples of how not only do networks within regions act and behave, but the connections between brain regions are also very important. They're very complex. So again, at the beginning, I talked about the complexity. So within a certain region, you have such complexity of neuronal connections that form states of the brain. And then the states in one region activate neurons in another region of the brain that adds to the complexity. It can become very complicated to understand how a thought, moves within a brain from region to region, it can become very, very difficult to understand that, because this is happening in real time, in milliseconds. It's very, and imaging studies cannot do that fast enough, so it becomes very complicated. Actually, I don't know if we want to do a breakout session or if we want to have questions and answers.
Let's do some questions. Give me just a second. So firstly, folks, I just want to step back a little here. This is this field of neuroscience is going through a golden age. I mean, just amazing new information is coming out. Now, it is absolutely true that it is still at a primitive stage when you compare it to something like physics, like mechanics of Newton. Compared to that, our understanding of brain is nothing. But this is how you start. This is how a field starts. And what we are doing here is Sanjay has agreed to do a series of meetups on this. This is the third meetup, but now we're going to be doing one meetup per month. And we're going to be covering different aspects of it. We're doing a meetup this Saturday. So could you talk briefly about what you're doing on Saturday?
Sure. So Saturday, we're going to go to a pretty hot topic. It actually came up in today's discussion also. We're going to look at consciousness. Now, consciousness is an extremely difficult topic. And I think most of the people in the audience don't have a background in the neurosciences. Some may not have a background in sciences. So I know it's going to be very difficult to talk about, but what we're going to do is we're not going to answer all of consciousness in one talk in 2 hours. It's impossible for us to do that, for anyone to do that. What we will do is we'll take an exploratory method on Saturday, and we're going to ask questions primarily. We're going to look at what neuroscience, now neuroscience has been, especially in the last 15 years, there have been a lot of papers and a lot of, not studies so much, but a lot of speculation and a lot of ideas that have been put forth on what is consciousness. And they've looked at a lot of the different knowns in neurosciences since the last 3 decades. And different scientists have put together a lot of ideas around what is consciousness, how does it arise, what does it exactly mean, how does it occur within the human brain, does it occur in animal brains other than human brains? So we're going to look at it from a broad perspective, but we're going to mainly ask questions, and then subsequent to that, in a future discussion, we'll actually go more in depth. One other thing I do want to mention is that about neuroscience in general, I completely agree that neuroscience is in its infancy. It's not in its infancy in the sense that we don't know much. What in neuroscience, what happens is that we're able to explain functions of the brain at the lowest level. We can explain that fairly well today. And some things at a mid-level we can explain, or we can have theories around, we're starting to understand. But complex behavior that get into personality and motivation and why people do things, that's beyond the grasp of any of the sciences, anything right now. Human beings, we don't understand that in any area right now.
Thank you, Sanjay. So folks, this is the series, and we invite you to keep coming back. All of them are going to be listed on the 52 Living Ideas. Not all meetups are listed everywhere else. Our friends in Philadelphia list the Wednesday ones, but we're going to have some Saturday and Sunday weekend ones too. So please join 52 Living Ideas. So now we're going to go to questions. We're going to give priority to people who have not asked the questions before. So we're going to start with Steph, Linda, and Jennifer. Steph.
Okay, great. Sanjay, thank you so much. My question is around ideation. What does neuroscience know? Is it nature or nurture?
It's both. And I won't say neuroscience knows, because again, like any sciences, any area of science, there is no one established set of truths. Depending on the scientist, depending on their expertise, depending on their specialization, they may know an area better or worse. But in general, the types of things that I'm talking about are in general, what's generally accepted in the neurosciences. ideation is something that there are models that represent it. So this is something that I talked about in one of the earlier talks. And so ideation basically is the concept of what is an idea, what is a thought in a brain, and how is it represented in terms of the interconnections or in terms of the activation in different parts of the brain. And two ways to well, it's really one, but there's two parts to it. One is within the overall brain and then within regions of the brain. And this part is where it's not very well defined yet, because, for example, and ideation is a broad area in itself, because when we're talking about ideas or when we're talking about cognitive concepts that we hold, the idea of there's a Zoom session in front of my eyes, right? That's an idea that I'm forming. Now that ideation is actually mediated by sensory perception. My sensory systems actually are activated, and I can see that there is a Zoom session in front of my eyes. And so that helps to form the idea of a Zoom session, because there's a physical thing that is formed, a representation of it that forms in my brain that helps me to ideate what we're talking about. Now, there are other types of ideation which is much more complicated. If we're talking about quantum mechanics, which different people had mentioned in the talk today, right? That's something where we cannot see quantum states. We literally cannot see them because they are so small, and they are random, and they are so rare. So, but yet we can still have ideas around what that means. So the simpler levels of ideation, neuroscience has some concepts around. The more complex ones, it doesn't have very concrete concepts, but it's starting to form generalized notions of. One of the concepts that neuroscience sees in terms of ideation is that regions of neurons, so if you, let me give a simple, let's take a simple example of 10 neurons. They form, and this is a very simple, in the real world, ideation requires much more than just 10 neurons. It requires millions and probably billions of neurons for any given idea. So if you take 10 neurons, those 10 neurons can be activated in you can say 2 to the 10, so 1,024 different combinations. Okay? You can have all of them off, you can have all of them on, you can have one on and the rest off, you can have two on and the rest off, et cetera, right? So you can have multiple combinations of neurons that are on and off. Okay, so just with 10 neurons, you have 1,024 states of on and off. And that's in a simple model of the brain. If you think of neurons as being completely on or completely off, then you have 2 to the 10th power. If you think of neurons as having more than just two states of being fully on and fully off, it becomes mathematically a much larger number. But so these 10 neurons would be in 1,000 different patterns, right? So in a sense, these 10 neurons can form 1,000 different ideas. Okay, now it's not, I don't want to say, I actually shouldn't say that, because it's not as simple as that. Probably what happens is that out of those 10 neurons, some of those neurons are critical to the formation of ideas, and other neurons among those 10 are support neurons that help strengthen or weaken or train or remember the ideas. So out of those 10 neurons, only maybe 2 or 3 are used for formation of ideas, and the others are support neurons that help to function with ideas. And so those three neurons would give us 8 possible ideas. So out of those 10 neurons, this simple model, they may be able to represent, let's say, 8 or 10 different ideas. Okay, so a state of a neural network, state of a set of neurons, is the concept that is considered presently in neurosciences.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Linda, Jennifer, and Ash. Linda.
Sanjay, thank you. This is fascinating. My question, background to my question. If we do a prefrontal lobotomy on someone, we've basically flattened their personality, done some other damage to their thinking. If we do a functional MRI or a PET, we can kind of see where the brain is lighting up. Is there any study that we can actually stimulate certain parts of the brain and see when what I'm going to call the personality disappears? And I'm not sure if I'm explaining this right. If we can see where someone's thinking about a particular thing with studies, if we also know that if we destroy certain parts of the brain, we've changed the personality. Is there do we have any mapping of where the personality basically lives? I know it's a really, am I asking too much, Sanjay?
It's okay. No, it's a good question. It's a very broad question. So personality doesn't reside in one or just a few sections of the brain. It resides throughout the brain, and actually it's the interconnections. So remember those interneural connections between regions of the brain. That's what's important to understand when we're talking about personality, because personality derives from movement of energy, movement of neural information, not just the movement, but the state. I'm trying to think of how to explain this simply. So what's that? You're muted. Anyway, let me finish this.
If we know that, and we do know that the prefrontal lobotomy does change the personality, so we know that there's a certain very important part there. Do we have any concept of where the other most important parts are?
Yeah, so we do have understanding of certain types of high level behavior. So for example, executive function, some levels of cognition are in the prefrontal cortex. The neocortex is where a lot of thoughts reside. There are the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is where aspects of consciousness and awareness reside. So we do understand that there are many different regions of the brain where so for example, the hippocampus is where a lot of memory structures reside. So one of the things that happens in neuroscience is that, and one of the challenges in neuroscience is that we cannot go into a living person's brain and play around with it because it's unethical to do that. Okay? So one of the ways that neuroscientists have learned over periods is two methods. One is to see disease states in people who have natural diseases or accidents. So if there's damage to a specific area of the brain, and they can still communicate with that patient, they can try to examine the patient to see what loss has occurred. And that has actually advanced. Initially, it allowed a lot of advances in neurosciences. And for example, Phineas Phase and their famous stories of people, the prefrontal cortex was cut through in his prefrontal cortex when he had a spike that went through his brain. There were many types of accidents and diseases that happened that explained this. There are also some types of voluntary surgery where a person will allow themselves to be, they're not fully under anesthesia, they're under anesthesia, but the brain doesn't get affected by anesthesia. So the cranium is part of the cranium is removed, and the neurosurgeon can activate certain parts of the brain while they're conscious and awake and active, and they can communicate with them to help them understand what's happening, but it's very limited what they're able to do, even in those circumstances. There are ways that we can find out, but this is one of the challenges in neuroscience. This is the reason why imaging is one of the main tools that neuroscience has, because it's non-invasive. It doesn't cause damage or cause permanent change to a person.
Next up is going to be Jennifer, Ash, James, Vanessa, Kevin, Jean, Cotton, and Hiro. Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi, Sanjay. Thanks so much. I kind of two questions. You can choose one or the other. I'm a linguist, and I've always found it fascinating how. Actually, I'll just ask this question. I've always found it fascinating how it seems like our native language is mapped differently from any subsequent non-native languages we learn. So my native language is English. My second language is Spanish. I've studied German. I've studied Portuguese. I've studied Italian, Russian. Have there been any studies done about how native languages are stored versus non-native languages, and any mapping that occurs between the two of them, or between the native versus non-native?
There might be studies. I'm not aware of that because that's not an area that I've looked into. But you know, when you brought this up, something that came to mind for me is that is consistent with how aspects of learning happen. So, for example, the first language that you learn would, and let's say we're talking about the auditory system of the brain, the listening part of the brain, because that's an important part of language. The first language that you learn will basically map that section of the brain according to the rules of that language, right? So the phonemes of that language, the sentence structure, the timing of sounds, right? Because languages have gaps in between, right? And those are just as important as the sounds and the tones. The intonations, there are many aspects of language, of frequency. So the brain structure would record those characteristics of that first language, okay? And they probably will not be lost because that first language that you learned will remain with you, unless you forget that language. If you forget that language, then those neurons and interconnections that map the structure of that language can be rewired by a subsequent language. But as long as you're retaining your first language and you're adding on a second and third and more languages, what will happen is that those secondary and tertiary languages would have to kind of fit into the existing matrix that the first language formed, right? So it kind of has to find and expand onto based on what's already there. And it will kind of erode some of the aspects of the first language. So, for example, when you learned Spanish, English doesn't have a rolling R, but Spanish does, right? So let's take the other way around, that if you learn Spanish, someone learns Spanish as a first language, and they have the ability to roll their R's, right? And subsequently, they learn other languages which don't have the ability to roll R's. And if they're speaking in those languages more often, they might lose the ability to roll their R, or they might lose slightly the ability to roll their R's because the subsequent languages, the ones that they're using more frequently, don't require those areas of the brain. Right? Does that, hopefully that explains this a little bit.
And next up is going to be Ash. Ash, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Sanjay. So when you were showing the slides about neural connections and kind of comparing that to like other massively complex networks like the internet, that actually kind of reminded me of the t-shirt I'm wearing. I don't know if you can see this, but it's a shirt that was designed by the physicist Richard Feynman, working with a graphic artist. And it's a representation of a theoretical supercomputer called the connection machine. And you can actually see him wearing it like in lectures you can watch on YouTube of him talking about computer algorithms and things. But then a guy named Danny Hillis, actually, who was a graduate student at MIT working under Marvin Minsky and Jerry Sussman and Claude Shannon, actually built this computer based on this t-shirt design that Feynman came up with. And it was one of the first massively parallel supercomputers. So that's just kind of like an intro into what I wanted to ask you about, which is, can you talk a little bit more about the parallel information processing structure of the brain, like the reasons for that as against like a sequential information processing structure of more like classical computing, and sort of, I guess, like the implications for that on brain function?
First, let me say that Richard Feynman was one of my favorite theoretical physicists. Fantastic. So yeah, the connection machine was ahead of his time. And yes, the brain is basically a massively parallel organ. It's a massively parallel. You can think of it as a supercomputer, in the sense that each neuron is a very simple processing unit. It acts in a very simple way. It takes inputs from multiple sources, which are the dendrites. It coalesces them into the nucleus, and then it makes a decision of whether it's able to activate or not. Okay. So if all of the inputs it received from the neighboring nodes are sufficient to activate it, it gets activated. And once it's activated, it passes on its signal to its neighboring neurons. And that cascade of activation, and similarly, there can actually be deactivation. So some neurons can activate others, and while they can actually also deactivate others. So this complex scenario of activations and deactivations across millions of neurons is similar to what happens in a supercomputer. And this is also the reason why artificial neural networks in that area of engineering is also modeling, in a sense, a neural computer, our brain. I mean, they're very strong correlates. They're not the same thing. Now, one of the things with in supercomputers and computing is that the topology of the computer is very important with what it can accomplish and how easy it is to get it to do work. One of the things of the brain is that there are two parts to topology in the brain. One is that the brain, when it forms, its topology partly is wired through DNA, right? Our genetics partly wires our brain with certain structures. So for example, the layers in the neocortex, the 5 to 6 up to 8 layers that we have is part of the topology. The cerebellum having the high density of neurons, the different regions of the brain and how they are formed and shaped and develop and grow. These are all structures that are decided for by our genetics, by our DNA. And so that's, in a sense, the topology of what a supercomputer would have. Also, the interconnections between neurons within specific regions is not very well understood today in the brain. This is an area of a lot of research. The mapping tools that we have, the imaging tools that we have they don't have sufficient resolution to be able to, on a large scale, it's not just resolution, it's resolution, bandwidth, it's dynamic range, it's multiple aspects of imaging and information gathering that's limiting us in our ability to understand all of these complex nature of the neural network that our brain is. But yeah, there are a lot of parallels with supercomputers in the brain. That part we know.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Julie, James, Vanessa, Kevin, Jean, Cotton, Jairo, and Joe. Julie, what's your question?
I was trying to look it up right now. I don't know the guy's name, but I heard it on Coast to Coast, and he has a school where you go and is a brain training, and he says that with biofeedback, you can get to that place that it takes the gurus years and years and years to get to, just by the feedback. I was wondering what you thought about that, and as far as what they're doing. I mean, I know that Dr. Amon's doing a lot of research with depression and the different, he's very, very, I respect his work a great deal. Have they done any studies on when people meditate and what goes on when people get a certain frequency?
Biofeedback is the simplest form of biofeedback is actually used, in many areas. I don't know the school that you're talking about or the course or the researcher, but biofeedback is something that does work if it's used in a certain way. It's reinforcement type of learning. It's a behavioral model. As far as I think what the second part you asked about was the what was it? The second part you?
Just like Deepak Chopra talks about the brain chemistry of people that are meditating, and have people done studies on what state that is or frequency that people get to?
Yeah. So frequencies in the brain is actually something that's not understood, and it's actually not accepted also by a lot of neuroscientists, because frequencies have to do with I mean, the brain is so complicated that when you're talking about a frequency, think about it this way: if you had 80 million neurons, or let's make it simpler, if you had 1,000 neurons, right, and they all have a different frequency, then sum total frequency of those 1,000 neurons would give you a number, right? But it wouldn't tell you anything about that. It wouldn't tell you that those 1,000 neurons are operating at different frequencies. You'd be getting a single frequency. So you'd know very little about those 1,000 neurons by just doing a frequency analysis. So it's a very crude tool. frequency representation of neural states is a crude tool. It's a tool, but it's a crude tool. It doesn't give us a lot of information.
Next up is going to be James, Vanessa, and Kevin. James.
Okay, hello again, Sanjay. I wanted to, I have an easy one this time. I just wondered, like, about brain folds. I read something about the being reducing pressure during brain development, and but I was wondering, are there any higher learning? Is there any higher learning about brain folds? Does it have anything to do with the regions, development of brain regions, and so forth? And why do some animals have more brain folds than others?
So, I mean, the brain grows to a certain size that's dictated by our genetics. And the various different regions of our brain grow to specific sizes relative to the person, the organism. And what size means is surface area, right? So the brain has surface area and also it has volume. And so it keeps growing up to the surface area and volume that is, in a sense, programmed to grow to through our genetics. And our brain actually grows beyond just the simple size of our brain case. And that's the reason why we have brain folding. Folding actually allows the brain to increase its surface area. And, you know, for all practical purposes, the foldings are kind of random, similar to our fingerprints and other random activity in biology. I mean, there are certain folds that are always there. That's because of the order in which different regions of the brain grow. So if one region grows before another region, then its size would be larger and it would kind of obstruct the growth of another region. Therefore, it may cause a fold to develop in between. So some folds are there almost always, but other folds are kind of random.
Next up is going to be Vanessa, Kevin, Jean, Cotton, and Hyro. Folks, keep your questions short so we have some time for takeaways. Vanessa.
Sanjay, that's been quite intriguing. I've got a question, that one that you showed, that one slide where it showed the 5 neurons connected to the yellow one. And I'm thinking that where the human experience, that's probably the best word, of guilt, if that kind of has a home base where it's more central, because a dog knows he's done bad, kind of reacting off of her own thing, but I don't think a dog experiences guilt to the point that humans do. Does that kind of have a core area in the brain and maybe, like I said, a secondary where it may be housed?
Each of the emotions that we have, whether it's guilt or anything else, they exist simultaneously in multiple regions of the brain. It may be that one region or two regions are more dominant, but they have activity in more than one region. And I can't say about any particular emotion, where they, what regions are activated, but it's multiple regions.
Next up is going to be Kevin.
Thank you, Frank. Changes from the neuroscience perspective, what's your suggestion when you hear the phrase like "I know myself, I know how to do"? So, following question: how can we improve our self? Like the following question. The second one is there any research about connected two individual neural systems communicating each other directly? Thank you.
I didn't understand your first question. I think you were asking about how do we know?
Yeah, that's let's say people general concept. I know myself. I'm an adult, so actually I feel we know few actually, right? Especially
how do we know we exist, or how do we know we're alive? Or what aspect?
Like I know how to do. I know the concept. I know what's the decision is right or wrong. I know my belief is correct. I know lots as general sense. Like from your perspective for yourself, like, do you see I know yourself refers to people, or how do you understand others see this to you?
So let me answer that in a more broader sense. How do we know anything, right? And specifically, how do we know ourselves? So how do we know anything is that we learn, we we learn to know things about the world, and we know that we exist in the world, right? So when we see ourselves in a mirror, or we see ourselves interacting, or we see our hand in front of our face or in front of our eyes, right? So through experience, we get to know the existence of things in the world, and but in our brain, there's a parallel mapping, or there's a parallel awareness of the physical world. The physical world doesn't exist inside of our brain. Our brain only has interconnections and electrical activity. But those electrical activities form states, and some of those states are states of awareness. So when we say we know something, we're aware of something. That's a simple way of explaining it. It's a complex idea that you're asking.
Thank you, Sanjay and Kevin. Next up is going to be Jean, Cotton, Jairo, and Joe, and then we're going to talk about takeaways. What are you walking away from this meetup with? Jean.
Yeah, I have a question. One day I just happened to listen to NPR. They're talking about Einstein's brain. They were looking for Einstein's brain, and they was able to find it. And so at the time, they preserved the brain, but they don't have the technology to research on that. So then the doctor actually steal the brain and carry it with him go to another lab. Anyway, I want to ask, so what they found is there's more connections. So I want to ask is a high IQ, how that reflect in neuroscience, that more cells or more connections? And what about EQ? Is there a scientific base of this IQ or EQ, in the physical representative in your neuro study?
Yeah, I mean, the problem there is that we have no definition of what IQ or EQ is. So it's not possible. Neuroscience does not have an explanation for IQ or EQ yet. It might never have it, because those are two concepts that are very difficult for us to explain, even in mathematical terms. But if we can explain it in terms that can be put onto paper, like right now we don't have any way of defining what IQ is. Right? Is IQ the speed at which a mind functions? Does the speed of processing go into IQ? We don't know. Right? Nobody really knows, because IQ is not defined in any sense. IQ is defined in a very broad statistical sense that based on testing, and the testing changes over time. So it's a very nefarious, there's no definition around it.
Next up, sorry, go ahead.
There's no scientifically acceptable definition of IQ yet.
Okay, next up is Cotton.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just lump together my takeaway and my question quickly.
No. Just the question, please.
Okay, the question is, in your modeling, and I remember you were shaking your head when someone, I think, mentioned the quantum mechanic aspects of free will. Do you find that you have some sort of limitations that perhaps that, are there some areas in research in modeling, like that may explore, say, like quantum, theories of, like, you defined that you talk about the states of the neurons, et cetera, like, for example, kind of aligned to the areas in like quantum computing, like, say, qubits, instead of like discrete states, you have a sweep that you can have multiple probabilities where, this neurons may be, is that kind of a area, area of your modeling in?
Let me give an example. I mean, someone else asked a question about supercomputers, and you're talking about quantum computing. So let me try to combine the two and try to explain it using these two concepts. So if we can explain a lot of the behavior at low to mid levels of a brain using supercomputing theories, right? And we can do the same thing using quantum computing models, because quantum computing models are a superset of traditional von Neumann type computing, right? They basically allow a qubit is it's not random, but it's a multi-state bit, whereas in traditional computing, a bit is has a binary state. So we can definitely define the brain using quantum computing. We can use a quantum computing model, but it wouldn't necessarily add anything to it. It would add complexity in the model. The model would be much, much more complicated, but it wouldn't give us any more understanding today. That's what I'm trying to say, is that we don't need to. I'm not saying quantum computing, I'm not saying that quantum effects are not present in the brain. What I'm saying is that today, there's no reason for us to add that level of complexity into our model because it doesn't give us anything more. I mean, we understand quantum effects somewhat, in the sciences, but there's no reason to add that into our model. It's almost like, if you're trying to explain why, elastic collision in pure physics, right? Elastic collision doesn't require quantum effects because you can fully explain it without quantum effects, right? Now you can add in quantum effects into an elastic collision and your equations would be much more complicated, but you'd get nothing more out of it. It's the same type of thing. You can add it in, but it doesn't, right now, it doesn't give us anything more.
Let's do one thing. Mike has not asked the question before, so I'm going to go to Mike. And sorry, Jairo and Joe, what we are going to do is that let's go to takeaways so that we wrap up everything by 12. Mike, what's your question?
Well, two things, and I won't go into what Sanjay and I discussed at the break time about quantum computing, but how do you explain neuroplasticity, and how do you explain Jung's concept of group consciousness?
Two questions. So neuroplasticity, I had a slide on that to some extent. So neuroplasticity basically is the concept that our brain adapts and changes over time, depending on not just age, but depending on circumstance and situation and neural load, the environment that it exists in. And the primary mechanisms is that there are changes in different parts of the neurons themselves. So for example, the number of neurons that are present, the depth of the dendritic tree from each neuron, and the length and the connections of axons from each neuron. Those three aspects of each neuron can multiply or decrease, can increase or decrease. So you can have growth in those areas, and you can also have pruning in those three areas. So depending on the growth and the pruning, those changes in the connections of the network of neurons causes neuroplasticity.
Wonderful, thank you. So folks, it's time for takeaways. Let's be brief. I want to wrap it up in by 12. So in just a minute or two, I'm very excited about this series, both on the topic, and I think Sanjay is doing a magnificent job. He has a breadth of knowledge, and he's able to talk very simply in a very objective way about what we know, what we don't know, just in a very straightforward way. And he's able to field a whole range of questions. So that's just wonderful. But I want to see what everybody else has to say and what they're walking away with. So I'm going to start with Jean, James Cook, and Cotton. Jean, what's your takeaway?
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
so, Jim or Jean? Is it me?
Jean, yeah, yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I actually, my takeaway is I think it's very exciting because I think I encounter a lot of medical problems like with my kids, because each doctor only see like if you have eczema, they just use something to repress the symptom. They don't really find the source. And I think with this neuroscience, they will be able to find what's the root cause of the problem instead of just treat the symptom. So you see 5 different doctors, they all try to repress their part of the symptom, then they show up in somewhere else. So I think then you have more integrated, holistic way to treat human.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Next up is James, Cotton, and David R.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to do a lot more research into the field, the areas of neuroscience that I find the most interesting. And, like brain regions, the movement of neurons, and so forth. A lot of the subjects that Sanjay has introduced tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Next up is Cotton. David R. and Joe. Cotton?
First of all, Sanjay, you're always the best, the best. My only limit is that I missed one of your lectures like a week or so ago. But anyway, thank you so much. You are expert in your field. What I took away from this is neuroscience is like one of the most complex sciences out there. And that reminds me of like say rocket science. Okay, you send payloads up into space, but on the other hand, if you think about the rocket, it's just like this humongous, nothing but like a fuel tank that you're going to dispense later on just to put a little tiny little speck of payload up into the upper atmosphere. So in other words, as you also said, it's kind of in its infancy, right? Even though it's extremely complex, the theories, the analysis, the modeling, so complex, but it's still so new. And I'm just excited that, you know, you know, of the future advances. But I think in some ways, though, they have to kind of like dislodge themselves from the conventional thinking and go into that bad area, that.
Thank you. Thank you, Cotton. Next up is David R., Joe, and Linda. David.
So, yeah, great job, Sanjay. Really enjoyed the presentation. I guess my takeaway from this is it's very thought-provoking how you take the discussions that we've had on the physical, whether it's the chemical, the structural, the electrical aspects, and make the connection to effectively our consciousness, our ability to create abstract thoughts, our ability to store memories. So it's a very, I find it something that will need to be thought through on how do you go from the physical to the level of our consciousness.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. So what we're going to do is after takeaways, Sanjay has 2 summary slides. So that's what we'll end with that. So next up is going to be Joe, Linda, and Mike. Joe.
Yeah, it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Sanjay. I mean, it really provides, I think, a foundation to walk through and start to ask questions about the topic. I'll be really interested in going forward, some of the ideas around neuroplasticity. I mean, we got into that a little bit this evening, but how the brain can change and some of the things that it can specifically in its relationship to abstract thinking. I was actually kind of really interested in it as well. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this series, and I think this really provided a very good foundation as to what we need to come back and ask better questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Linda, Mike, and John. Linda.
Sanjay, thank you. This was excellent. You really whet my curiosity. I'm looking forward to your next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Next up is Mike, John, and Ash.
Okay, as echoing what everyone else has said, you've presented a wonderful analysis of the field, and I'm impressed with what your breadth of knowledge in this. I am deeply involved in the issue about quantum computing, and by evidence of quantum computing in the brain, the eye is the rods and cones are really neurons. And people who want to diagnose Alzheimer's disease without surgical techniques go look at the retina and see what's going on there. That is and Feynman in his cellular automata came to that same conclusion, that the brain is a quantum computer. And he outlined in his cellular automata papers what a quantum computer needs to be. To bring this to conclusion, the concept, Jung and Pauli had a relationship. when Pauly went through his divorce in the 1930s.
Mike, let's do one thing. We're going to have to do a meetup just with you. You know, you always have amazing things to say. I have to always remember to give you time limit, and you have amazing things to say, and we have to do a meetup. All right, sir.
Can I finish the one thought?
Yes,
one
please.
thought.
Yes,
1930, where Wolfgang Pauli learned how the mind works from Jung. Jung learned how quantum electrodynamics works. And that's where global consciousness in the Red Book came from. And Mind Matter papers by Pauli, they both were considered not mainstream. And maybe we'll go into that at after Saturdays. But
sounds good, Mike. I will talk to you, and let's figure out something. Next up is John, Ash, and Barry. John. John, you need to unmute yourself if you want to. Okay, Shirley, you have unmuted yourself, so you can go ahead and talk about your takeaway.
Okay, I just want to say thank you. And food for thought. Isn't it amazing of all our organs, that is the only one that gives us permission to study itself?
Thank you, Shirley. John, do you want to unmute? Okay, so let's go with Ash, followed by Barry. Ash.
Thanks again, Sanjay. I've recently listened to some other courses on neuroscience, and this was really a fantastic overview. I guess my main takeaway is just kind of like all of the different levels of organization of the brain, you know, from the individual cells to the interactions between cells to the broader networks, and how they're organized into these different brain regions, and then interaction between the different regions. And so it's just fascinating how like you were talking about, where you're kind of studying it from the ground up, and hopefully eventually this will lead to much greater ability to understand behavior. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ash. Next up is Barry, Victor, and Faye.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I appreciate the fact that you are always using that hammock over there to relax next to the ocean, because that's a very important part of using the brain. It's calming yourself. And I think you have confirmed from your presentation that it's really important that we have an understanding how our brains work in order to use them to the maximum ability that we have. And that's what I'm going to be talking about on December 23rd, about being a super ager and keeping your brain young, even in your 90s.
Yes. So folks, so 2 weeks, no, exactly, I don't know, on 23rd of December. It's all mixed up in my head now. It's, I think, 2 weeks from now. Yes. Barry is going to be talking about how to be a super ager. You know, what do you need to do in order to keep your brain and mind active late into your life? What does it take? What do you need to do? What kind of attitude do you need? How do you need to do that? He's a living example of it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from him and getting some advanced tips. Next up is going to be Victor and Stephen and Jairo. Victor.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Sanjay. That was an amazing presentation. I took away a lot, and a good snapshot of where we are with neuroscience, a good history, and with the brain itself, how it functions, and how we actually evolved over millions of years. So that's a very good snapshot of the whole information. I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So next up is Stephen, Faye, and Jairo. Stephen.
Sanjay, I'm going to be an echo chamber. Thank you for imparting a part of what you know. I could tell when you got asked a question, you were going deep. Thanks very much. Great presentation.
Thank you, Stephen. Next up is Faye. Faye? go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. Excellent presentation, Sanjay. I'll put in chat. We did a meetup, I think back in April, on the book Behave by Sapolsky. It's very detailed, again, in the brain, has a lot of information, more in layman terms, but excellent talk tonight, J&J.
Thank you. Let's see, Jairo, Kevin, and Julie. Jairo?
Thank you, Sanjay. Oh, wait a minute. Thank you, Sanjay. I learned that I'm just a complex machine and I don't have a soul, but maybe there's something behind it that's doing the experiencing. Maybe that's my consciousness or whatever. We'll get to that next time, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Kevin, Julie, and Vanessa. Kevin.
Thank you, Sankan. Sanjay, thank you open my mind. To learn more, I don't know about my brain. You make me kind of mind open again. And I feel like we live a fairy tale. Our decision is based on 5% of a universe we see. With our new neural system, not just can connect internally, also can connect to externally. That's possible make our less misleading, misunderstanding. Thank you. Good work.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Julie, Vanessa, and MJ. Julie?
I forget which president, but somebody said that the 80s was the time of the computers, and then Bush said that the 90s was the time for the brain. And back then I used to carry books like orthomolecular psychology around with me because I was interested in it. But tonight you've shown me how much, even though we haven't gone very far, you've got so much more since when I was looking at it. So it makes me very glad that 52 Living Ideas is on YouTube, so I can go back and take it a little slower. Thanks.
Absolutely. And there are 2 of his talks on YouTube already, and we are going to keep, everything. We've got over 225 videos, so check them out. Next up is Vanessa, MJ, and Rogine. Vanessa.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. You made your explanations very accessible. There was like 5 terms like the dendrite tree that I was hearing for the first time, just like when I took nuclear physics back in high school. We didn't speak of the positron. So like I said, new terms are coming every day, and you made it, like I said, it wasn't to the point where brain freeze, I got to tune out. So good job.
Thank you, Vanessa. Next up is MJ, and Rogine. MJ? Okay, next up is Rogine. Okay, so my takeaway is that the thing that really blew me away was your description of the network and just the different layers, the differentiation of densities, local connections versus distant connections, and how complex this whole shebang is. And that is simply the brain of even a more primitive organism than us. So it just makes you appreciate the complexity of us. And it just, the structure actually mirrors the complexity. So I think I was really blown away by that. So Sanjay, shall we do your closing slides?
Sure. Yeah, I just have 2 quick slides that I think might summarize. People had some ideas, so these slides might shed some light.
Absolutely. And after that, if you want to do any closing thoughts, you're welcome to do that, sir. Go ahead.
So let me do a screen share. Should be up now, right? So, so the question is, what must we know to understand neuroscience? Right? What are the ideas from neuroscience that we all need to understand? So first, in the web of life, we are not special. We humans are not special. Our brains are not special or magical. That's, I think, important to understand, that everything that we see about our behavior can be explained so far. Everything that we've seen can be explained. It's just that We don't have the tools today to be able to go in depth to understand them. But at the level that we're able to observe, we are seeing a lot of information. We're able to explain a lot of things. Next, the issue of mind versus brain. This came up in periphery in several questions, and we didn't get into it deeply, but in general, neuroscientists, don't believe that there's something separate called mind that's separate from the brain. They believe that the brain fully explains the mind. And I'm not saying every neuroscientist, but in general, neuroscientists believe this. Because, and again, it's because there's no reason to think otherwise. Next, nervous system is made up of matter and molecules, and it's animated by energy. This is pretty fundamental. And what this basically says that it's deterministic, that it acts using rules, often simple rules of biochemistry and physics. And also, this is a concept that this last point on this slide was a concept that was around last decade, the decade before, about our being born as a blank slate, as a tabula rasa. And neuroscience and psychology in many fields have shown that that's not true. We are born with innate habits. We are born with innate structure within our brain that causes us to behave in certain ways. Next, somebody asked a question about nature versus nurture. And excuse me, this is something I didn't go into a lot, but this is a very powerful concept, not only in neuroscience, but throughout biology. And it's that nurture reprograms nature. So nature is the characteristics of us that we get from DNA, from our genetics, from our parents, from our biology, right? So we're born with nature, and then nurture is what happens to us after we're born. And so what this is saying is that we're born through nature, we're born with certain characteristics already built into us, and nurture can modify those default behaviors or default activities or default structures. So nurture can reprogram us in more complex ways, but they both are required and they both work together to make us what we are. Network theory explains much of the brain's overall behavior. Neurons operate together in regions, the overall brain, and with the brain and body. And neural activity within and between networks, so within clusters, within regions, they generate learning and memory, brain states, which are analogs to thoughts and feelings, and all of the complex interregional behaviors that create everything that we do, from simple things like walking and physical behavior to language, which is somewhat cognitive, to dreams, which can be, you might say, metaphorical, to the most complex, which are our personalities. So neural activity creates all of these aspects. So that's overall what I wanted to present. Takeaway for me is that this is really a field that, not a takeaway, but this is a closing thought that I wanted to leave with everyone, is that this is a field that's still growing. It doesn't have answers yet. We shouldn't expect it to. I mean, no scientific field will have answers to everything ever, because what happens in science is that as you learn things, you also learn that there's more that you don't know. And so the act of learning actually introduces new questions and new ideas and new areas for investigation. So this will happen in neuroscience, but right now we know that there are broad areas that we don't know yet. And the limitations right now are more in the tools that we have. And because we don't want to harm people as we study, and neuroscience is one of those fields because it deals with our nervous system and our brain, which is the most important organ, you might say, right? It's what makes us human beings. It's what makes us characteristic of who we are. And we don't want to harm that when we're studying a person or when we're studying groups. So it adds a lot of complexity in how we do this. But it is, we are finding ways of doing research more and more. So I just wanted to close on that. This was very interesting for me. I love having the questions. I actually learned from the questions also. So I want to thank everyone for participating.
Yeah, I just want to say that I was really blown away by the questions. But more importantly, these people behind it, these people are deeply interested. Firstly, the interest is very large, interest is very deep, and it is very diverse. So the range of issues that were brought up by various people was amazing. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, presentations and conversations going forward. And Sanjay, thank you so much. This was just wonderful. And thank you, everybody. And good night. I hope to see you on Saturday at 12:30 Eastern Time for continuation of this about consciousness. See you then. Bye.